The ranch belonged to Elias Ward for miles, grass and raw fence and the low, clean sweep of the sky. He could tell you, if anyone ever asked, the exact number of acres his name was on, the slope of every ridge, the length of the creek when it narrowed to a trickle in late summer. What the land did not belong to, what it had never learned to keep, were the small, hollow places inside him. Those were private and unnamed, held tight under weathered palms and behind the steady work of his hands. It was coming on dusk when he noticed the light at the gate. Not a lantern swung by a neighbor or a coach's lamp, but the thin, damp shine that clings to a person in rain. Slick hair, shoulders hunched under a soaked coat, a silhouette that seemed to owe itself to shadow rather than to the lamplight he'd left burning in the cabin. Elias was closing the barn door when his mare, restless inside, craned her neck and snorted, breath steaming into the cold. He paused, towel in hand, and watched the figure step forward, boot soles making quiet punctuation against the mud. The gate creaked when she pushed it, and there was no grand entrance beyond that small, breathless sound. Rain beaded on the brim of her hat and traced dark lines down her coat. She did not approach like someone expecting charity. She walked like someone who knew the weight of a gate and how to lift it without making a fuss. She stood for a moment beneath the crooked post, and then looked up at the house, where the single lantern cut a circle into the dusk. "You Elias Ward?" she asked. Her voice was small, but steady enough that the horses heard it and quieted. He kept his hands where they were, not ready to close the barn just yet. "Aye," he said. The word came from habit, short, practiced. He didn't ask what she wanted. He didn't ask why she'd been out in this weather. There were times when questions were bread, and others when they were knives. Tonight he let the bread come later. "Shelter," she said. "For a night. I don't mean trouble." He looked her over with a patient, quiet appraisal. Hands, the way her shoulders held themselves, the tilt of her jaw. There was a ridge of muscle in her forearm you only saw in people who worked with animals. There were traces of blood on one sleeve, a dark smudge on the hem of her trousers. That smudge read like a map of a recent flight, hurried, not hidden. Elias pushed the barn door open a little wider so the mare could see her. The horse's nostrils flared. Out of habit, more than kindness, he spoke to the animal, a string of soft syllables in the low of his chest. The mare leaned out, nose reaching for the stranger, as if she trusted the shape of her hands before she knew the person. "Name?" Elias asked. She rested one hand on the mare's warm flank, as if the gesture was a signature. "Tiana," she said. He felt his throat dry at the simplicity of it. The name fit her, short, direct, unadorned. It was as if her voice had placed it down and closed off any discussion about ownership or origin. She was not asking him to own her. She was giving him a fact. "Come in," he said after a moment. The word sounded less like an offer than a decision. There was a slow thunder in the distance, the storm extending its fingers over the land. He turned and stepped toward the cabin. Rain clicked against the eaves like thrown pebbles. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and last week's stew. A single lantern hung near the table, throwing a small island of yellow into the room. He moved with the sure, economical motions of someone who had learned to let the house answer his needs without much fuss. He freed a towel from the peg and dropped it near the door for her to use. He lay fresh wood onto the stove and pulled a pot to warm. Fingers that had held ropes and reins for years, suddenly gentle, as if remembering how to hold a cup. Tiana peeled off her wet coat and folded it on a chair with the deliberate care of someone who had been taught that things have a proper place. When she removed her hat, rain beaded along the edges of her hair like a crown of small, honest jewels. She accepted the towel without a question, dabbing at her sleeve where the dark smear stood out like a stubborn blemish. "You can sleep by the stove," Elias offered. "Blankets clean enough. Warm water if you want to wash." "No, I'll keep my things." She moved around the cabin in the margin between being self-sufficient and not imposing. She set a small sack on the floor, opened it, and unfolded a few tools: a spool of thread, a strip of leather, a tin with some herbs. Simple, careful things. She looked once at the stove and then away again as if to examine something that wasn't meant to be seen. He knew how to give shelter without asking too much. He also knew the thin, fierce pride in people who could not afford to be indebted for kindness. He stacked another log in the stove and then sat back on the edge of the table, not pressing her, allowing the quiet of the room to fill the space between them. Rain made its own small pattern against the window. "What happened?" he asked finally, because the question hung in the air, and he had meant it to be quiet and open and not accusatory. She tightened her fingers on the tin until the knuckles paled. "I was on the road," she said. "I left. Someone followed." She did not say who. She let the sentence stand like a stone in a pool, and the ripples said enough. He didn't press. He wasn't a man of idle curiosity. He was a man who measured what he needed to know by the work he would have to do with it. She had come for shelter. The first work was to make sure she wasn't freezing. He ladled steaming water into 2 tin cups. The steam carved little ghosts into the lamplight. She accepted the cup with both hands and drew the heat against her palms, as if reading a map of warmth. Her hands were calloused, the nails short and practical. He watched how she drank. Careful, not quick, as if each sip was a thing she meant to keep. Outside, the wind grew teeth and worry. The mare in the barn poured a rhythm against the stall board. Elias listened to the world as if it might speak in a language he had nearly forgotten. In this house he had kept the lantern lit for reasons that were never fully spelled out. Habit turned into ritual. There was comfort in such small, steady lights. Tonight it felt like a courtesy contrived by memory. She said after a while, "I won't be here long. I'll be gone by dawn." The sentence was both a promise and a shield. He believed her partially, not because he doubted her word, but because promises were like fences. They could sag under weather. People moved across them when the wind got in. He nodded and set his cup down with the precise care of a man who had learned how to keep things from spilling. "You rest," he said. "I'll check the barn." The barn still hummed with its own life. He lingered by the stall, hands on cool wood, feeling the weight of routine like good leather. The mare leaned into him when he brushed at her shoulder, a trusted, simple contact. Tiana's hand had been on her flank when she'd entered. It was the same hand now that lingered in the animal's breathing. There was a small exchange of trust between animal and woman that said more than any speech could. The mare settled, lowering her head, eyes soft. When he returned to the cabin, the storm had drawn tighter, as if the world were pressing close to hear something. Tiana sat with her back to the stove, chin tucked to her chest, eyes on the window where the rain made a smoky screen. The lamplight wrote a thin line across the floorboards. The rest of the room was a study in shadow and warmth. He moved to the chair opposite and sat without speaking. 2 people and a fire. It was not the crowded company of a town hall or the clumsy comfort of a family dinner. It was contained, exact. She watched him as if testing boundaries. Then, in a voice that held neither plea nor defiance, she asked, "You ever been out on the ridge when the lightning comes down?" He had been. He remembered standing with a youth's bravado, feeling the hair on his forearms lift as the air tightened with electricity. He said so then, letting his memory be a bridge, not a barricade. It was the kind of small confession that never demanded anything but acknowledged that they had both known the same thing. She smiled then, a quick private lift of the mouth. "I like the sound it makes," she said, like the world remembering to be itself. It was not an answer to the rest of the night's questions, but it softened the space between them. There was an odd companionship in noticing the same thing and having that be enough. Words were a relic. Attention was a covenant. The storm did not rest. It lay its hand on the land through the night. Thunder rolled distant and then closer, like a horse's hooves over plain. Elias woke at one point, a small animal stir from the mare at the edge of sleep, and found Tiana sitting awake too, facing the darkness beyond the window. She had wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the lines at the corners of her mouth drawn in a way that suggested habit, not pain. He watched her for a long minute, the way you watch someone you have decided not to pry into, and then he went back to sleep like a man who had agreed to keep a secret. At dawn, after rain had promised to leave, the land smelled layered, wet earth and the green aftertaste of leaves. Tiana was already up when he pushed the door open. She was at the trough, rinsing mud from a pack with hands that bobbed and moved with a practiced economy. Sacks beside her lay open, small things arranged neatly, a knife wrapped in oilcloth, a bit of spare thread, some dried meat. She moved with the kind of small order a person keeps in order to sleep at night. "You said you'd leave," Elias said as he came down the steps. The house had reclaimed its quiet. Birds worked the air like stitched notes. Steam rose from his cup. He felt the old reluctance, the fenced-in place of a man who had learned how to be alone and liked the performance of stillness. But there was a different weight now, a new ledger of obligations that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with the human necessity of not turning away. "I meant to," she said. Her voice was steady. "But there's a mare in your barn needs dressing. The wound looks deeper than the night allowed me to see." He felt a small economical relief, like a tool finding the right slot. Work made the world comprehensible. "Show me," he said. "Bring her out." The mare stood with the grace of a large animal used to being handled, and the wound near her shoulder was a ragged thing, dirt-packed, the skin puckered in places. Tiana worked with a calm that came from long handling of fragile things. She unsheathed a small blade, rolled some linen, and bound the wound with methodical hands. Elias watched as if from a distance, close enough to matter but distant enough to learn rather than instruct. He fetched salve then, and offered it without pretense. She accepted and smeared the medicine with the same quiet focus. "How'd you know how?" he asked finally, because the question felt easier when it was about animals than when it might have been about life. She met his eyes for the first time while she worked. "I've had to keep things from bleeding on me before," she said. The sentence did not invite pity. It invited recognition. He nodded. He understood that kind of knowledge, the knowledge of what must be done to keep a thing from turning against you. They worked side by side for the better part of the morning, mending fence posts with rope and new slats, hauling wire that sang under the strain of wind. The work made easy conversation, the kind that is mostly about rhythm and the space that opens between people when their hands are busy. Their silence held weight. When words came, they were almost always practical, an economy of speech that matched the hands. "You sure you know the way?" he asked once, when she paused on the ridge to look back at the house. She traced the path of the creek with her gaze, the thin line that had often been his map for moving stock. "With enough sense," she said. "There's a path along the old ash. Keep to the meadow when it turns, or it'll chew the hooves." She gave a small, precise description. It was the kind of talk that asked for nothing in return. It was enough to say she could move across land without being lost. It was enough to say she saw the world as a map of small facts, not dramatic narratives. At midday, after stitches and posts, they sat under the eaves, the sun like a slow coin of heat. The mare ate placidly, nostrils flicking mud at the ground. Tiana peeled an apple from a scrap, offering Elias a slice. "You cook good," she said, when he produced the meatloaf he'd been saving for a single meal. The compliment landed like a small, honest stone. "So do you forage," he offered, because it felt fair. She ate deliberately, not greedily. There was a spareness to how she took things, a quiet thank you that didn't loosen her edges too much. This is where the early part of their acquaintance braided into something that looked like promise. For Elias, who had let the house keep him, who had arranged his days around quiet and the predictabilities of fence lines, The presence of another deliberate person made the world feel fuller in a way that frightened and steadied him. For Tiana, who had been moving with the momentum of someone trying not to be found, the existence of a steady routine and a place where someone thought to keep the lantern lit was not a rescue, but a discovery of a harbor. After they ate, they walked the low fence line together, hands often slipping close but not touching in any deliberate intimacy. They tested posts and tension, speaking in short sentences about the future of the herd, about where the wire sagged dangerously after storms. When their hands brushed, it was incidental. When their eyes met, there was an answering that neither rushed to define. "You could stay a while," Elias said once, as they patched a corner where the wind always found a way to loosen the wire. "I won't be forever," she said, "but I can help. If I'm here, I want to do what needs doing." He found that he liked the sound of that. Her placing herself in the terms of labor instead of letting himself imagine her as a mystery to be solved. It kept her agency intact. He liked the fact she wasn't waiting for him to offer. She offered herself. A small, almost imperceptible tightening came when, later in the afternoon, they found tracks. At first it was only one, deeper than the others, a boot print near the creek that pressed into the soft bank like a thumb into wet clay. It ran parallel to the fence and dipped into the tree line before bearing back toward the ridge. They found a second, where the boot had slipped and turned, dragging a faint line where something metal had scraped the soil. Tiana crouched without hesitation to follow the line with her fingers, the way a reader runs a finger under a sentence. She smelled of sweat and wood smoke, quiet and plain. "He's been watching," she said. She didn't need to say more. He understood by the way the syllables hardened around the edges. Elias felt the old reflex in his chest, an immediate tightening that mapped itself onto memory. He had learned, in his years, how people watched others for reasons that had little to do with care, and everything to do with the wanting to possess. He had seen it in men at auction, in neighbors' eyes over landlines. He knew the posture of entitlement when he saw it. He also knew how such men measured danger, by the loudness of threats rather than by the quietness of women who said no. They did not speak for a long time. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. At the fence, Tiana leaned with one arm over the top rail and let the other rest at her side. The movement was casual but exact. It looked like someone who had placed their body where it could be seen and not moved without deciding to. Elias stood a little off from her, hands loose at his sides. "We can ride out," he said at last. "See if he's still out there." She shook her head. "No," she said, "not by riding. He knows the lines, knows the way the lights are. He's not looking for a straight chase. He watches, he waits. If we ride, he follows with what he knows. The best thing is to make the place hard for him to move through. Put things up, make our steps clear." His hands moved on their own then, grabbing nails and hammer, hauling wire. They worked with a kind of urgency that was composed and practical. They reinforced gates, added crossbeams to the fence, stacked brush along low places where someone might attempt to cross unseen. They drew the world tight around them with the best weapon they knew, good planning and a readiness to meet force with steadiness. Toward evening, they sat again by the stove. The day's labors had made their muscles hum like well-tuned instruments. Tiana's hands bore new little specks of sawdust. Elias' palms had the neat grime of rope and wire. They were both tired in the way that follows work done properly. The lamp cast a familiar circle. They ate sparingly in the hush that follows a day when both you and the land have been measured and found worthy. "Why'd you come this way?" Elias asked as he peeled the skin from his slice of bread. He had not insisted on a story earlier. Now the question felt less like an interrogation and more like a way to understand her map. She considered the question as if it were another tool to be selected. "I had a plan," she said. "Plans don't survive people sometimes, so you divert and keep moving." Her eyes met his, and there was a sharp, modest humor there he could almost touch. "You keep a good place," she added simply. "You keep a light." He accepted the small praise with the simplicity it deserved. "Given what we found today," he said, nodding toward the patched fence, "maybe you should stay until the tracks fade." She laughed, a short upward sound. It was not mirthless. It was more like the crack of a whip, quick, bright, attention-grabbing. "Maybe I will," she said. "Not because you told me to, but because there's work, and because you let the lantern burn." The words sat between them like a small, honest offering. Before she drifted to sleep that night, she took up a small needle and began to mend the leather on a saddle that had seen better years. The motions were quiet, rhythmic. Elias watched her work with a new angle of attentiveness. Not the watchful distance of a man guarding his property, but the careful regard of someone seeing the world repaired by another's hands. He felt something loosen inside him, like a gate that had been stuck and finally given way. He thought of the title he carried, like an invisible staff across the country. Man of acres, owner of land. The words had always been literal: deeds, fences, livestock. But with Tiana in the house, and the mare settled and the fences mended, the word ownership felt smaller and less absolute. There was something new at the edges of his life, something that hinted the land might not only be something he had, but something he could share. He did not know yet whether he was ready for such a change, but he could feel the shape of it, not as loss, but as a widening. On the third morning after she arrived, Tiana woke early and moved out to the creek to check the lines where the bank had softened from the rain. Fog lay low on the water like a thin cloth. She walked barefoot at the edge, hands in the pockets of her trousers, and the land made a small private sound beneath her feet. Elias watched from the distance of the porch, coffee cupped in his hands. He felt a small, steady curiosity like a horse's steady stride. She called to him without turning. "There's smoke on the ridge," she said. The word was ordinary, not a summons, but the way she said it made his chest tighten a little. Smoke in the distance could mean a neighbor's kitchen or a careless camp and a drifting brand. It could also mean someone watching and marking the land in the way a man might map his intentions before crossing a line. They went up together, not riding but walking, an economy of movement that matched the mood. The world here was wide and breathed easy. The ridge cutting the horizon like a slow spine. From the high place they could see a thin grey column of smoke to the southwest, near a copse of juniper that didn't belong to him and had been a place for passing travellers to rest. The smoke was small and steady, the kind made by purposeful hands rather than a long, useless fire. Tiana squinted, the sun behind making silhouettes. "Someone's camped," she said. "Maybe a week off, maybe sooner. Doesn't look made to pass, looks made to wait." Elias looked at the ridge, at the thin grey that marked a human presence, and felt the old reflex again, the way a man measures distance and decides how to shuttle his responsibilities. He did not feel heroic. He felt precise. There was a long inventory that had to be considered: risk, the limits of his willingness, the protections of the land and those who walked it. He thought of the tracks they'd found, of the way a man can watch and pretend that looking is the same as holding. He thought of Tiana's steady hands. "We make the place seeable," he said. "Lights at night where we can, gates fastened, someone awake at the right times." She nodded. "And when he comes close." Her voice was even, no tremor, an edge like steel under silk. He set his jaw in a way that surprised him. "I stand in the line," he said. The sentence was both particular and wide. It meant the practical work they would do, watching the ridge, keeping the lights, and it meant something more. A readiness to place himself between a threat and the woman who had chosen to be there. He had been shy of people because proximity hurt. Now proximity felt like responsibility in a new form. They spent the next day making the ranch less hospitable to someone moving at the margins. They rearranged lanterns so light would catch a shape before it could hide. They threaded wire along the auxiliary trails and looped brush across low passes. They practiced small company drills, a lantern in the window, doors latched, the rifle kept where both could reach it if needed. Everything was done quietly, with the kind of calm that spoke of people used to making small preparations against the slow and patient danger the world sometimes held. When they finished, from the ridge, the house looked like a little bright dot in the rolling green, lanterns like beacons, the barn a dark companion. It was modest, it was stubborn. It was a place someone could find if they meant to, and a place someone could be deterred from if they did not. That was the point of the work, not to erect a fortress, but to show an intention that would not bend to small willfulness. As the dusk settled, Tiana stood at the gate and listened, her profile cut against the last of the sun. Elias came up behind her and leaned on the post. Their shoulders touched, brushing in a way that was unremarked and, for both, felt like the naming of a fact, two people occupying the same hinge. They watched the land together, not speaking as the long western light drew line and then blur across the plains. "We should check the ridge at first light," Tiana said. Her voice was steady. It was the kind of plan that did not ask permission. It only stated need. He agreed. He had no intention of being a hero, but he knew how to keep a place and the people who kept it. He had, over the years, learned that the greatest protection was a stubborn commitment to ordinary things, fences, food, light. He had learned to stand where needed, standing as the line between someone else's claim and a woman who had told him she wanted to keep moving on her terms, felt new but not unnatural. They went to bed with the lantern left burning, the thin, faithful glow a hand held out to the dark. Tiana moved in her sleep with the easy, measured motions of a person who is used to not trusting the night, but managing to find rest anyway. Elias lay awake for a long time, hands folded over his chest, thinking in the arithmetic of distance and deeds. The word owner sat light on his tongue, less sure now of what it could mean when people were around to refuse being owned. When dawn broke, it came like an answer, pale and certain. They saddled the mare with the care of people who knew each other's readiness. The animal nudged at Tiana as if offering a small benediction, and she scratched the warm place behind the ear, and for a second she smiled, a slow, private thing, an expression that belonged to no one else in the world but the animal she tended. They rode to the high ridge, a steady pair against the breath of morning. Below them the ranch was a neat, small thing. On the other side, the land rolled out to where the juniper copse rose like a small clump of memories. The smoke column was there again, more visible against the clear sky. At its base, a horse picketed and a man moving near the fire. The silhouette did not look ill-intentioned from this distance. Men camped on trails for all manner of reasons. The worry was in the sedentary aspect. The fire made to watch rather than to pass. They dismounted a good way off, and Tiana walked the laterally broken paths, reading the ground with a patient, exact intelligence. "He's not alone in wanting," she said finally. Her hand cupped the print of a boot shallow in the soil, and the way she handled it wasn't simply evidence-gathering, it was respect, like reading a passage of scripture. "He sends ash to gather here so the wind tells him what's moving." Elias looked at the man near the fire again. Up close the stranger's features were more obvious, a hard jaw, a hat that shaded the eyes, a way of sitting that put his weight forward, as if to say the land itself was his to lean on. He had a rifle leaned against the tree beside him, muzzled toward the sky like an accusation. He reeked faintly of tobacco and oil, the small smells of a man keeping himself together by certain habits. Tiana said nothing at first. Her jaw set in a way that made the line from ear to chin look like a bar of iron. "He came through on foot," she murmured. "He knows the way across open. He's been watching for a surrender." Elias felt the blood settle in his limbs. The ranch was his by law and ledger, but what the law did not speak to was what a man would do when someone sought to treat another human like a thing to be retrieved. He had not promised to be a savior to every wandering soul. He had promised to keep this land and the souls who happened upon it in the specific and begrudging way old men promise, by doing what needs doing. And this man near the fire had, by his posture, the air of one who regarded people as possessions to be returned to their place. Tiana folded her hands, not in supplication, but like a person drawing the bow of an instrument and setting it to the string. She stepped forward a few paces, deliberate, and the man saw them and stood. He put his hat in his hand, as if that were a greeting. His face had the color of men who spent too much time wanting what belonged to others. "Morning," he said. He did not sound like a poet. He sounded like a man who had practiced a voice before going out into the field. Tiana set her chin, and her eyes were the kind that did not beg for mercy. "We're passing," she said plainly. "We were here to check on the ground." The words were tidy, practical. They might have been about a herd or about the quality of a well. Given to the wrong ears, they could be read as acquiescence. The man's glance slid from Tiana to Elias and back, assessing the man who stood behind her. He smelled like a man who believed in easy returns. "You sure she's got a mind to run off?" he asked, meaning the woman as an object to be accounted for and not a person with footprints. Elias bristled. The old reflex sharpened in him, not to violence, but to a steady, implacable set of boundaries. He stepped forward so that the space between him and the stranger could be read as an invisible fence. He could feel the weight of deed and title behind him, but that was not all that held him here. The more immediate measure was Tiana's eyes, the steady line of her mouth, the fact that she had chosen to come and had chosen to sit at his table. He would not be the man to let another man shoehorn a woman into the shape of possession. "She's no one's to claim," he said, his voice low and even. He did not raise his hand. He did not draw his gun. He spoke as if reading from a ledger, a fact. The stranger's face hardened like old leather. He took a step forward, not with the bluster of a brawler, but with the measured step of entitlement. His hand hovered near the rifle, as if the weapon was a thing of right rather than of threat. Tiana's posture, when she straightened, was not fragile. It said rather that she chose where lines would be respected. "Leave us our course," she told him, and in her tone was the dry iron of a person who had been practiced in refusal. The man's eyes flicked to Elias, then to the land beyond, as if calculating the price of persistence. For a long second, the world was busy with the small processes that make up a potential fight, the way a horse shifts its weight, the fact that a crossbeam creaks with wind, the way a shadow falls over a mouth. No one moved too quickly. Things that mattered were decided in the slow, measured space where people weighed their pride against the cost of action. He finally stepped back, scraping a foot like a man clearing loose weeds from his boots. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, the words like a warning and a pact all at once. "We know enough," Tiana said. She did not look away. The sound of her name was functional in Elias's mind, a human with a will and a map of where her feet would go. He thought of the ridge they had walked, of the careful light in the windows back at the house, of the way she had begged no favors and refused no work. In those facts lay an unadorned, ordinary courage. The stranger leaned against his tree a moment longer, then swung up on his horse. The animal stamped and turned, uneasy as if sensing the wrongness of a man's intention. For a heartbeat, Elias thought the man would not leave, that things would escalate into the kind of ugly bargaining that scars a place. But the man rode away slowly, not with the bluster of vanquished pride, but the measured gait of someone deciding that the cost of staying was higher than the uncertain relief of taking. When he had gone, the silence settled in a new shape. The ridge seemed to shrink a little, as if whatever had been pressed against for so long had been given a small space to unfurl. Tiana exhaled and sank to a stump, the day suddenly heavier and lighter at once. "He will be back," she said without drama. It was a flat statement of future fact, not a prophecy or a plea. Elias felt the weight of the phrase. He had stood for purposes more abstract in the past, for the way ownership of land meant quiet vigilance. But this felt different. The man's presence had been a test not of law, but of will. And Tiana had been the one to say no. She had not been rescued. She had stood. They rode back in a companionable silence that felt less like two people bound by circumstance and more like two figures marking an agreement. At the gate, Tiana lingered with one hand on the post. She watched the house with attention that was not merely practical and not yet intimate. It sat, small and bright, in a world that was always ready to demand more than it could justly claim. Inside, Elias set the lantern nearer the table. There was a small ritual now in the way the house breathed when they came in together. Wood stacked, door latched, lantern lit. The routines that had once been solitary had room now for another pair of hands to make them better. Tiana sat and mended a strap, while Elias prepared a simple supper. Their conversation was small and steady, the kind that fills a house with life without explaining itself. Later that night, the mare shifted in her stall with a sound like a soft complaint. Tiana sat by the stove and listened, then reached over and placed a hand on Elias's knee. The contact was brief but sure, the kind of punctuation that said more than a dozen promises. He rested his hand over hers, not taking, not claiming, but letting the warmth of someone else's presence be an answer to a long, internal account of loneliness. They spoke of small things, plans for the garden he'd always meant to start, but never had the heart to tend, the pasture's turn later in the season. There was an easiness to talk about things to come, the way people who mean to stay share chores and dreams. The word "we" hovered in the air like an unlit match, neither hurried to strike a flame, but the possibility of fire glowed in the thought of it. Outside, the night folded over the land like a soft, watchful hand. The lantern burned on the table, and the house seemed to pulse with the ordinary amenities of human life: a cup of tea, a blanket flung, the slow creak of settled wood. In the barn below, the mare ate her hay in easy rhythm, the small, dependable breathing of an animal that trusts the place that shelters it. Elias drifted to sleep with the knowledge that the man who'd ridden away might return. He did not lie awake imagining violence. Instead, he catalogued what needed to be done if the man came back. The list was practical. Locks tightened, lights brightened, paths made visible. The list was not heroic. It was steadfastness in measurement. Tiana slept with a light in the corner of her eye, the kind of alert that had become second nature. She dreamed in fragments, an open road, a crowd of faces she did not know the names of, a pair of hands working leather until it fit. Her dreams were not dramatic. They were the interior motions of a person sorting the day into manageable parcels. Morning found them both early. The ridgeline still held the faint smoke of old fires, but the man who had been watching was not immediately visible. They went about their tasks with the same measured rhythm, repairing, tending, preparing. The mare's wound was cleaner, the fence more sound. They worked as a unit without needing the word for it. Late in the afternoon, Tiana came back from a walk along the creek with something on her mind. She sat down at the porch with a small sprig cupped in her hand and watched the house. "He's drawn lines," she said after a while. "Not of steps, but of expectation. He thinks he can lay a path, and anyone walking it will end up where he wants." Elias listened, the word expectation sitting like a stone. He thought of the way men sometimes treated other living things, as if they were mapped on the land like fence posts, set and immovable. He had done his part toward keeping the boundaries physical. Now there was a different task, to uphold the boundaries of choice. They spoke little of how to do that. There was a tacit understanding that the work of protecting a person was not always about guns and force. Sometimes it was about making a life so that the choice to stay made sense. Sometimes it was about standing, simply and plainly, in view, so that the moral shape of a place was visible. It was about making the cost of wrongness higher than the childish relief of theft. That night they kept the doors closed and the lanterns lit. They sat at opposite ends of the table with a kind of companionable distance that neither tried to close too quickly nor widen beyond repair. Tiana stitched while Elias filed the small tools he kept out in the shed. Hands met hands occasionally, not as an act of claim, but as the brief coming together of two people who had learned to keep their own fires burning. It was the sort of touch that could be read as comfort or as claim, depending on who looked and what they intended. For both of them it read like something else entirely. A ledger entry that said, quietly, "We are here." Days folded into the kind of ordinary cadence that erases the edge of time. They rose with a light and went to bed with the same lamp still swinging its small, faithful halo. Their work arranged itself into patterns: mend a fence, feed the mare, check the water trough, pull up a post that had rotted under an indifferent winter. Tiana moved through the chores with the steady competence of someone for whom life had given few safe assumptions. Elias moved with the kind of practiced economy that comes from a man whose life runs on lists measured by weather and rope. Together they made the ranch less of a solitary ledger and more of a functioning machine, worn but well kept. There were small absurdities to learn. Tiana left a knife on the workbench one morning and otherwise always insisted on keeping her things near. Elias found, to his quiet surprise, that she favored the strong coffee he made and would pour it with both hands cupped around the tin cup the way someone keeps warmth like a secret. She learned the sound of his steps around the yard. He learned how she hummed when she stitched leather. The mare responded to her in a way she did not to others, softening instantly when Tiana's voice shifted from talk to low command. "Teach me to move a herd like you do," Tiana said one afternoon while they worked a broken corner of fence. She had sanded the splintered post with the same patience she used to mend raw edges in skin and leather. Elias glanced up at her and, for the first time in a long while, found humor waiting in his chest. He had not heard himself laugh out loud in years. "You don't need me to teach you much," he said. "You'll pick the ways you like." She made a face at him, small and quick. "I pick up tricks, not wisdom." "We all pick up tricks," he said, tapping a nail into wood. "Wisdom's just what they call the tricks that worked longer." Their small jokes were practical things, the kind exchanged between people who understood that words could be measured by usefulness. There were softer exchanges, too. A passed cup, an offered blanket, the way Elias would lift the lantern a fraction when she took a path on the ridge so she wouldn't stumble on the routes he knew by memory. The early days also brought practical negotiations. Tiana had said she would move on when she could, and she still said it sometimes as if promising the moon. But promises lived in the weather and shifted like cloud. Tiana settled into a rhythm of stay and leave that fit the calendar of mending rather than the calendar of sorrow. She worked because work kept her hands busy and because to be useful was, in her life, the only guarantee of rest. At night they spoke less of the past and more of the near future. The garden plan emerged slowly: beds near the back door, a small patch for herbs, a square of soil where sunlight did what work it had to. Elias had thought of a garden and never began it for reasons that pressed at the chest like a loose board. Tiana's presence turned the plan into action. She suggested a layout, an angle of the sun to consult, the best place to bank stones to protect against runoff. He listened, and more importantly, he dug. It was during those afternoons of soil and sweat that their conversation softened into things that were not about fixing fences. They spoke, minimally, of what they would do if they stayed. A joint ledger of small pleasures, a table with an extra chair, seed saved for the following spring, a morning to share without counting the cost. These were not proclamations of love. They were practical measurements of later mornings. Once after a long day of mending, Tiana sat on the porch steps and watched Elias as he methodically sharpened the edge of a spade. Her profile was a study, the jaw set, the cheekbone catching the sun. For reasons she could not name cleanly, she said, "Do you ever think of leaving?" Elias looked up at the question, like a man surprised by an old tool he had put away. "Used to," he said. "Young men think the road's the answer. I learned otherwise. You can carry an ache with you, or let it sit somewhere and be useful." "And are you tired of carrying it?" she asked. He did not answer at once. There was a part of him that cradled his losses like a ledger, kept them precise, neat, the way a man keeps a proper account. But another part, newer and as unsteady as a rung on a ladder, wanted a different balance. "Some days," he said finally, "I don't notice it as much. It gets thin with the work." She considered him a long moment. "Then maybe it's not leaving you'll do," she said. "Maybe it's taking someone else with you." Her words were not a demand. They were a proposition. He met them without rush, the slow accounting of a man who had never been good at quick bargains. The notion of taking someone else with him, of including another life in the careful routines he had arranged, felt at once precarious and immensely right. It made his chest shift in a way that said more than a dozen vows. Their days continued, each one building toward the inevitable tightening they had been preparing against. The rider, or the man who would be called that in their private calculations, moved like a shape at the edge of the story. Tracks appeared at odd times, a boot print near the creek, a flash of a hat behind a copse, a bit of smoke lit and tended in a place meant to watch rather than travel. Each time the land told them someone had been near, Tiana and Elias reconfigured the ranch into an answer. Lanterns placed in a new array, brush stacked to show deliberate barriers, a post hammered with a force that meant no one would pass without making themselves known. They practiced the quiet code of readiness. It was not a war dance. It was a disciplined set of actions, doors latched, rifles kept in sight but not brandished, lanterns tended on the porch at night. Their nightly conversations sometimes hovered on the edges of what it meant to be watched. "He thinks he can make the world go where he wants," Tiana said once, her voice low. "He thinks lines on a map are people," Elias replied. "He doesn't understand that people choose their paths." "That's the line he'll have trouble with," she said. Their preparation was never in the realm of bravado. They did not rehearse violence as a spectacle. They made the place sensible, laboring as if the best weapon against injustice was simply the refusal to be easy to take. For Tiana, this was familiar strategy. Make the cost of taking you greater than the entitlement that made a man think himself owed. For Elias, it was a new kind of stewardship, keeping not only the land but the moral shape of the place in view. When the rider returned, he came as men like him often did, slow, with the kind of indifferent patience that believed the world owed it compliance. He rode in at a time when the light slanted low. A man riding like Rode had trained him, confident, a little swollen with the idea of his own right. His horse was a mean-looking brute, its flank rolled with unchecked work. He stopped a good distance off and watched them from the saddle, as if surveying cattle. They had not arranged to meet him. He had found his way by will and the small signals the land gave him. Tiana saw him first, as she tended the gate, one hand on the post. "He came," she said without shock. The statement carried no anguish. It was a fact. "Do you want me to talk?" Elias asked. "No," she said. "Stand." They met him at the fence, the three figures arranged like an argument. Elias's face was steady in the way used to measure a thing. Tiana's eyes were plain and unblinking. The rider unclipped his hat in a way that attempted to be casual politeness. His voice, when he spoke, had a greasy edge to it. "Looking for someone," he said. "Heard tell there was a woman out this way." Tiana's reply was immediate. "She's not for finding," she said. The man squinted, as if trying to reconcile what he saw with what he believed. He looked from Tiana to Elias and back, as if trying to find the loophole that would allow him to be obeyed. Pride has its own grammar, and the rider read the landscape in possessive terms. "She's mine," he said at last, the claim simple and stupid and intended to clip any argument. Elias stepped forward an inch. It was a small movement, but it shifted the air as though a line had been drawn. "Nothing about her is yours to claim," he said. "She chooses." The rider laughed, a hollow sound that tried to be both threat and jest. "Do you know what you're saying?" he asked. "You don't know where she came from." "You don't know who she is," Tiana said, and in that statement was the clean force of someone refusing to be rendered myth or property. She did not plead. She did not beg. She declared. The rider's hand moved to his rifle by habit. It was the reflex of a man who wished to make his will a physical thing. Elias did not move to meet him with steel. He met him with posture and principle, the kind of stubbornness that unpacks itself into action. A man standing between another man and what he would take. He could have drawn a line by making a show of weaponry, but he chose instead the slow, harder work of making the situation visible. He was present, alert, undeterred. Tiana stepped forward then, not to demand rescue, but to stand on her own ground. "Leave," she told the rider in a voice that did not quaver. "You are not owed me. Go." He spat on the ground as if to punctuate his irritation. "You don't walk when I speak," he said, a threat anchored as much in belief as law. Elias' reply was quiet. She already walked when she chose to. Now she stays where she chooses. Words in that moment were tools. The rider weighed them, as people with entitlement do, by the cost of pushing back. He was a man who liked to be used to getting his way. But the cost of staying had shifted. The ranch was not only a property on a ledger, it was a place defined by those who kept it. Elias's response, his willingness to be seen as a line, was more than a gesture of ownership of land. It was a claim on a principle: people choose. For a long breath, the three of them held position. The wind moved small things, a loose leaf, a scrap of paper stuck to a post. The mare in her stall stamped a rhythm like impatience. The rider finally swung up onto his horse, his face set to the hard lines of a man choosing to walk away rather than lose the argument without a fight. "You'll hear from me," he called over his shoulder, the kind of threat that pretends to be promise. Tiana spat once onto the dirt and did not answer. The man rode off slow, the animal's hooves chewing at the track until he was nothing more than a smear on the horizon. When he was gone, both of them exhaled in different tempos. Tiana came to the fence and leaned her hands on the rail. Elias stood beside her and did not touch. The space between them was large but warm in the way unspoken things can be. "He'll be back," she said, in a voice like a clock that had been wound and knew the length of its tick. Elias thought of the man's bare intent. He thought of the ways in which people think themselves entitled. He felt the old impulse to protect, hardened into a newer comprehension. Protection was not rescue. It was a practice, the steady refusal of others' expectations. "If he comes," he said, "we're ready." She looked at him then, and in the way her eyes held his, there was something like an offer and an assessment at the same time. "I want you," she said without flourish, and the sentence fell as if it had been considered and chosen. It was not an offer of possession. It was a declaration of preference, plain, powerful, an assertion of agency as solid as any fence post. Elias felt the old catalogues of loneliness shift. Ownership had been literal for him, deeds and acreage and the weight of being the man who kept a place. But this was not about the land. It was about being asked, quietly, not to be alone. He did not answer in a grand speech. He did not promise forever in a way that would ring false. He folded the simple truth into something steadier. "I want you too," he said. The words were like setting a nail straight, practical, meant to hold. They did not kiss like a storybook. They touched as people who had learned how to treat one another carefully do, a hand on a shoulder, a brushing of palm on palm. The contact was not a claim, but a mutual agreement. Here is where we stand. It was a new kind of ledger entry in Elias's life, one that read fewer lines of ownership and more lines of shared work. The weeks that followed were not a montage of passion, but of practical integration. Tiana planted the first rows of the garden with a methodical attention to sun and soil. Elias learned to trust her decisions about when to turn the soil and when to leave it be. They shared morning coffee on the porch and traded stories that were small and true. The habits of a horse's footfall, the way a hinge creaks to warn you, the seasons the soil tended to forget. They moved cattle in a rhythm that required no speeches and no declarations beyond competence. There were evenings when the work and the world pressed close. On one such night, after he had mended a gap in the fence and she had tended the mare's sore, they sat by the stove and laid out a plan for the coming season. "We'll set the potato beds here," Tiana said, tracing a finger in the dust on the table. "And beans can go on the south side. It'll give you quick yield, and the beans will shade the ground for the cooler months." Elias watched her and, with a small, defiant humor he delighted in rarely, said, "You make it sound like a treaty." "It is," she said, "a treaty with the ground. Plans made their way into acts. Seeds were pressed into soil, and the green came because they had tended it. They put in a neat fence around the garden, not to keep people out so much as to remind themselves of a boundary they preferred, the place where they would nurture what they chose. People come and go on the land. Life is the patient, sometimes stubborn, business of tending what remains. Not everything settled smoothly. There were moments when old habits nudged at both of them. Tiana sometimes woke in the night and packed at the thought of travel, only to unroll her bedding and stay. Elias sometimes retreated into his ledgered silence, the same reserve that had kept him alone for years. These moments were not drama, but the small corrections that come when two lives try on each other's shape. They argued once, in a low way, about a stray dog Tiana wanted to keep. She wanted it because it was thin and used to hands. He argued practicality. In the end, they compromised. The dog stayed, but would be kept to the yard until Fat and Trust set it to a steadier gait. The argument, small and human, was more like cloth mending than a rift. Edges aligned, thread passed through both. Word of what had happened with the rider never quite left the lines of the county. Men told things in public houses and on porches that moved like moths. A man who stood up to another, a woman who refused. Some told the story with admiration, others with a creeping bitterness at a pride they felt slighted. Tiana and Elias paid these murmurs little mind. They were busy with the practical and honest efforts of living together. There was, inevitably, another return. The rider had not been a man to leave a thing undone in his mind. He arrived this time earlier than either of them had expected, near the end of a dry afternoon when the light made everything long and a little less forgiving. His horse bore the shabby impatience of one who had ridden too much, and he rode up the lane with a determined slowness that meant he thought the land would yield its secrets. This time, however, he did not come to the gate alone. He had two others with him, men who looked like they had been handed tasks and accepted them rather than taken them. They rode with the confidence of men who believed a single man could bend a situation with brute insistence. Tiana saw them first, a shadow breaking through the heat. She came to the porch with a small, tightened readiness, and Elias followed with measured steps. They stood at the rail together, not touching, two figures who had learned to be aligned without needing to speak. When the rider stopped and dismounted, the tension was tangible. The men behind him stayed on their horses like dark punctuation. The rider walked to the fence and leaned with a calculated ease. "I told you I'd find you," he said. He's smiling like a man who expected the world to be pleased to be set straight. "Leave," Tiana said, and it was the kind of single-word command that closes arguments rather than opens them. The rider laughed then, and it sounded like a sound meant to be both charming and threatening. "You think you can just sit on a man's land and say what he can't do?" he asked. Elias did not answer with heat. He answered with a series of small, visible preparations. He moved to the gate and latched it with a firm hand. He set lanterns a little higher so they could be seen from the road. He checked the rifle in the corner to ensure it was ready but still sheathed. These were not theatrical moves. They were the sober motions of men who know the measure of escalation. The rider misinterpreted them as hesitation. He took a step forward, his voice rising. "You think because you're a stranger you can take what you want," he said, gesturing at Tiana as if she were a thing. Tiana's face hardened. "I'm not yours to take," she said. "I asked you once to leave me alone." He answered with an ugly grin. "Who asked you anything?" Elias felt all at once the old ledger cough and expand. He felt the weight of the land, yes, but more strongly he felt the gravity of a human choosing. He said nothing extravagant. He stepped forward until his boots were near the dust the rider had disturbed. "You leave," he said, "now, or you find out what this place means." The rider's friends stirred like hounds sensing a trouble. For a beat, it seemed the night might yield to the sort of ugly commerce that leaves marks on both land and heart. Then Tiana moved. She did not plead for Elias's help. She did not ask for rescue. She walked to the fence and laid a hand on the wood, looking straight at the rider. "Go," she said. "You will not get me back by claiming what you did not earn." His jaw tightened. Possession is a brittle currency. He looked at his men as if expecting support, and then, maybe at the sight of faces stony as his own, maybe at the quiet which is like a rope around the throat of a boast, he swung. The horses began to shuffle. A breath could be heard as a kind of silence. He rode off, not with the arrogance of before, but with the small, bitter dignity of one making a measured retreat. There was no explosion of violence. There was instead a recognition of a cost not worth paying now. When the dust settled, Tiana put her hand on the rail and laughed, a small sound like breaking glass into clean water. It had no triumph. It had the weary lightness of someone who had been tested and found her footing. Elias came up beside her then and put his arm around her shoulders in a way that asked for nothing but gave steady warmth. The nights after the rider's last visit were quieter, as if the land itself took a deliberate breath of relief. There were days when Tiana would walk the boundary and call out to the fields with a voice that measured quiet possession, not in ownership, but in tending. They planted more in the garden, not for spectacle, but because tending was the simplest act of building a future that made sense. It took months, not a moment, for the idea of home to change from refuge to chosen place. Tiana's things rearranged under a roof that no longer felt like an emergency shelter, but like a shared space. Elias stopped calling the distant relatives he had not seen for years. He started talking about the herd in terms that included someone else's knowledge. They set a small table and kept 2 cups at the ready. Their intimacy grew by degrees. There were nights when they slept close, and other nights when the promise of the day required early rising and separate paths. There were small confessions, the times each had been afraid, the song that had been stuck in a childhood memory, the taste of last year's stew that never quite matched up. They were honest in the way two people who have learned to be useful to one another can be, not theatrical, but necessary. One evening, toward the end of their first season together, with hay stacked and the fences sound, they sat on the porch, watching the sun touch the western sky like a slow, burning coin. A breeze crept along the grass and gathered the scent of earth and distant smoke from neighbors' fires. The mare nicked in the barn, and the sound made a small punctuation. Tiana took Elias's hand then, not in the tentative way of those uncertain of welcome, but with the surety of someone who had considered and chosen. "When I came through that gate," she said quietly, "I did not expect much. I expected a night and an explanation." He turned his head and looked at her. The lines at his eyes were softer than they had been, more inhabited by patience than by a stubborn grief. "And now?" he asked. She smiled, a half-shut, secret kind of smile, the kind that spoke of things reserved for a particular person. "Now," she said, "I want you." It was not bravado. It was a clear sentence that announced the truth of her feeling and the authority of her choice. Elias felt the ground tilt in a soft, precise way. The word owner had been integral to him for so long. He owned the land. But here she offered him something that could not be owned, the decision to stay, the decision to be chosen. He answered simply, the way one answers a ledger after adding another line. "And I want you," he said, and the words were both an echo and a promise. The seasons turned. Spring came with a green urgency that made all their plans look small and patient. The garden produced its first honest row of potatoes. The mare's wound finally set well. The fences held through a late storm. They marked days like a joined calendar, a wedding of labor and quiet mornings, a handful of harvest, a shared laugh over a pot gone wrong. They invited no grand ceremony. There was no boast. Their partnership was stitched by small, repeated acts, repairing a post, warming a hand, sharing a cup at dusk. Once, in the thick of a summer afternoon, a neighbor stopped by on business and commented offhand about Elias's acres. "You own a good spread," the man said, almost admiringly. Elias looked out across the land then and felt the truth of the neighbor's words, in the old literal way, the deed, the borders, the pasture lines, and in a new way that made the word larger and less alone. "I own the land," he said, watching Tiana bending to the garden, "but I don't own everything on it." Tiana straightened immediately and looked at him then, with that steady, direct gaze. The neighbor grinned at the exchange, perhaps sensing there was more to the story than he had asked. The statement made its way into the quiet ledger the two of them kept, where sovereignty of land met the sovereignty of a person's will. One autumn evening, with the air close and cool and the long day making room for the short cold, Tiana stood with her back to the barn and watched the horizon. She had a small tin in her hand with saved seeds. She turned to Elias and offered them. For next year. He accepted them with the kind of careful gratitude that translates into action. "We'll plant them," he said. "We'll keep the lights lit." She stepped then until their shoulders touched. She did not lean into him as if to be protected. She leaned as if two things that create warmth do so by adjacency. "This land," she said, "it used to be yours, and no one else's. Now it is ours in a different way." He felt the truth of it, and the particular terror that sometimes accompanies change softened because it had been chosen rather than endured. The claim in the title that once might have read like a fact, "He owned everything for miles," became a piece of paper and not the story itself. The title of his life expanded to include a voice and a will that said, "I want you," and that voice made the land more fully what it could be. In the last light of that evening they walked the fence together, hands not always touching but present enough to be a line in the sand. The mare followed at a lazy distance, her breath steaming in the cooler air. The house glowed small and warm behind them like an honest lamp. They spoke of nothing of great consequence and of everything: seed beds, which cows to sell in the winter, a possible trip to the next town for salt. The future in that moment was not a promise of grandeur. It was the simple accounting of two people choosing to keep a life together. When night settled fully and the stars pulled the land into a small, familiar fold, they stood by the stove and listened to the small sounds: a hinge, the tick of cooling metal, the soft breath of an animal content. Tiana looked at Elias then, with an expression both fierce and unadorned. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For not letting someone else decide me," she said. He swallowed, feeling the old weight but also the new, honest balance of partnership. "Thank you for choosing to stay," he said. They sat in that silence long enough for it to mean something, a quiet that had been earned by joint labor and by the careful day-to-day pledge of keeping vigil for one another. Outside, the land stretched in measured darkness, the fences marking borders that protected both pasture and choice. The ranch still belonged to Elias on paper. That fact did not vanish, but the meaning of belonging had altered like light through a different lens. The acres he had measured and counted now held a life he had not planned by himself. Hands he would not claim, a woman who had refused being taken and had told him plainly she wanted to remain by his side. Her declaration had done more than shift his heart. It had reframed the landscape of his days. Ownership could be one thing on a deed and another thing in a life. On a late morning, not long after their seasonal harvest, Tiana rose early and found Elias already at the fence, checking posts. She walked to him and, without a great flourish, wrapped her arm through his. "You ever think how small a map used to look?" she asked. He smiled, the slow, soft kind that comes only after long, steady weather. "I used to think keeping people out was the point," he said. "Now I know keeping the right things in is what matters." She squeezed his hand and rested her head for a brief moment on his shoulder. They stood like that for a while, two figures shaded by the same small world. The mare leaned her warm head against the stall boards, and the sound of the barn was that of a place in which life was kept careful and good. Later, as the sun slid toward noon, they repaired a gap in the fence together, Tiana with the nail pounded in the right rhythm, Elias steadying the board so it would hold. Their hands worked in tandem, not as an act of possession, but as a repetition of a decision: to build, to protect, to choose. On the ridge, the wind picked up, and for a moment it felt like the world was testing their arrangement by simply being itself. They did not fear the wind. They had learned to read it, how it carried smells, how it found the path of least resistance. It carried to them, faint and human, the sound of a distant laugh from a town road. But it carried nothing else. No dark shape, no boot print that told of entitlement. Tiana straightened and looked out over the land. She turned to Elias and, with a modest fierceness, said, "I want you." He answered with a look and a simple word, and the slow, certain work of shared life. "I want you too." And the ranch, acres marked and measured, fences taut and honest, stood behind them, nothing less than a witness and nothing more than a field on which two people chose to make a life. The lamp burned at the cabin door that night, and for the first time Elias felt its light as a thing shared rather than a solitary comfort. The ownership that had once defined him did not disappear. It shifted its shape, widening to include the choice of another who had come through the gate not to be taken, but to decide. If this story touched you, consider liking and subscribing for more slow-burning frontier tales, stories about the small, stubborn ways people choose each other and the work that makes a home.